Go to this. All right, folks, we have made it to the very end of 2022. This last It Depends podcast is episode number 26. I started on this initiative at the beginning of the year, and what a ride it has been. I call this episode the capstone episode. Joe Reis and Matt Housely don't really need any introduction. They are the authorities in the space of data engineering. They published a seminal O'Reilly book. They've led several enlightening podcasts series this year and have generously shared their love for data and analytics with the global community. So here we are sitting down at the end of 2022 to reflect on what worked, what did not, how should we prepare for 2023. This year started so differently from where we are ending. The go-go days of unlimited VC-funded new ideas have hit the brakes. Many vendors are taking drastic steps to contain their burn rate. Growth at any cost is no longer the in thing. We think 2023 will continue to witness these headwinds, at least in the first half, before we see a steady recovery. The good news is both the data and analytics space and cloud computing have weathered the storm to some extent and continue to grow. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe and Matt. Matt, let's start with you. Although I already said you don't need introduction, but for those who have not followed you, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's funny. I originally came from academia, so I have a PhD in math, and I taught for a number of years. And then I got into data science, actually. And I discovered that most of my problems for delivering data science projects had to do with data engineering. So I kind of wandered into data engineering. And then at some point, a few years back, I met Joe, and he had a very similar experience, which he'll explain in a second. And so we started Ternary Data with Joe as the CEO and me as the CTO to try to solve that problem. And so we ended up writing the book as part of that whole process. Like, we had this opportunity to write for O'Reilly and kind of write about that experience in some sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Very similar path to Matt, except you can skip the PhD part. I don't have a math PhD. I do have a math degree. Been in data a bit longer as well, but 20 plus years. Really originally wanted to be an actuary, then I guess decided that that wasn't in the cards. So, but I've been doing data sciencey stuff, I suppose, for about that long. And just like Matt, found data engineering more as a necessity than a cool thing to do. I think back then it really wasn't a job title, which is something that you had to do to do your job as a data scientist. And so, yeah, wrote a book along the way, and here we are. So good to see you, Genjis.
Very nice. So I'm so glad I know we've tried to get this podcast done a few times, and then the winter storm caused us to reschedule a few times. So here we are. Thank you so much. So Joe, Matt, what I did was I thought through what were some of the hottest topics in 2022, and I picked about 10 of them, because we have about 50 minutes. So if we spend 5 minutes on each of these topics, then we can, go through them. These topics, I've divided them into business, organizational, data and metadata, infrastructure, and architecture. So not in any particular order, but we'll go through these topics. Let's start with data mesh and data contracts. We'll then talk about metadata, lakehouses, open source, cost optimized DataOps, edge computing, self-service, data modeling, data engineering, semantics, and streaming. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. This is the agenda for today. We will go through these topics. So Joe, let's start with you. How do you think we should be thinking about enabling data mesh, and in particular data products and data contracts?
Yeah, I feel like these topics are they've definitely been the hot topics of 2022. I think that'll continue into 2023, with the caveat that I feel like the education part is still something that's lacking a bit. Everyone talks about data mesh, and I would go out on a limb and say most people really don't know, exactly what it means. At least according to Hao Zhimak. defined it in her book and her articles. And so she's a Zhamak and I joke once in a while. She's like that character in Life of Brian who says he's not the Messiah. So so I feel like that's very much Zhamak at this point. But so there's the education part, but there's also the product end of things. And so products, for data contracts, data products, data mesh are forthcoming, I would say, from the very people who have been popularizing these ideas. Zhamak, I know has something in the works, so stay tuned on that announcement soon. And same with data contracts and Chad Sanderson. So what do you think, Matt?
Is Chad, so I know Chad has been very active on LinkedIn. Is he starting a whole company around data contracts? Is that what we...
The word in this read is, there's something coming out around that. Yeah.
So Zhamak,
I can't say much more. But.
I see. But Chad is so in 2023 we'll see more on data contracts, and then Zhamak also it's public knowledge, has left ThoughtWorks and is starting her own company. So we'll hear more about that. And so that's fantastic. Matt, what do you see as what worked or what did not work when we talk about data mesh, contracts, products, and so on?
Yeah, so I think a bigger theme here is standards. So in other words, if you're going to make data mesh work really well, you have to have extremely good interoperability standards between all of your data sources. And this is something we kind of talked with Zhamak about on a podcast episode. It was some months ago, but we discussed this idea. And the same thing with data contracts, right? Like data contracts are all about data exchange between different systems and processes and making sure that the data conforms to standards. So again, you have to have interoperability standards to talk between those systems. And I think we've seen a lot this year that kind of underscores the difficulty of building commercial standards. So for example, Twitter is the de facto public messaging platform, even though it's privately owned. And we've seen this year that maybe things can change very quickly with the standard platform. I won't get too far into it, but I think everyone here probably has opinions about what's going on at Twitter and how things change pretty fast. Another example of standards that maybe aren't so great is ANSI SQL. So for example, Google BigQuery, that's ANSI SQL compliant. Snowflake, also ANSI SQL compliant, completely incompatible. You can't just port SQL from one platform to another. And so I think the big challenge for vendors and for standards bodies is to define true standards that people can trust in the long term, where they can look at the standard and say, okay, if this company gets a new CEO, it's not going to break the standard. And it really is compatible across systems. And I think if someone can solve that problem, be it a standards body or a commercial company, in a way that's to everyone's liking, it's really going to move both contracts and data mesh forward a lot.
My best line about standards is that the standards are great. There's so many to choose from.
Yes. Yeah. And again, ANSI SQL is really a collection of just a bunch of different options, right? It's not really a standard. And so that kind of limits its utility. Like it has some utility, but it's not all it was intended to be. And so if we can do better than that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So. But, I do like the concept of data products.
Yeah.
I think applying product management discipline to presenting your data in a consumable form, I think that, to me, that is the one standout feature of data mesh, is this, thinking about the user interface, the user behavior, having an iterative process so you can continuously modify and update and have release, and actually large number of release cycles, and automating that whole process.
Yeah, I agree. And it very well could turn out that, it might just be like what microservices, what happened with there, where it's like, what's the company behind microservices, right?
Yeah.
So it's more of an approach and thought process. So there's a lot of gaps that need to be filled in. I mean, even if you talk to Zhamak, it's like some of the tooling to enable the data mesh, at least as she sees it, it doesn't exist today. And so that's the hurdle. Plus, what Matt said is 100% correct. For decentralization to work, you need some sort of a strange, ironically, you need some sort of a way of standardizing the interface between all the interoperability. I don't know how it would work otherwise.
Yeah. So talking about interoperability and standards, I've been a huge fan of metadata, because I find metadata is a glue and there's just so many use cases of metadata, data quality, data catalog, lineage. We now are seeing data observability also show up. Joe, back to you. How do you feel metadata evolved in 2022 and what we should expect in 2023?
Yeah, I definitely feel like the discussions have become a lot more, I think, mature uh, and I think coherent around metadata and related products like data quality, data catalogs, and so forth. I really think the challenge for 2023 is going to be turning that messaging into something that's, I think, really easy to understand for decision makers, right? There's a lot of data catalog companies, a lot of data quality, lineage companies and so forth. I think the crux of it's really going to be, okay, great, you're selling me a product, like what's it going to do for my business? And these very, I would say, lean, cost sensitive times. So, but I think as an overall architectural ingredient, it's absolutely necessary to get to where we need to go. I mean, metadata plays a role in exactly the previous discussion we had on data products, for example, right? And so I don't see the underlying notion of metadata going anywhere, but I think there will be a bit of a I hate to call it metadata winter, but there's going to be winter. There's going to be winters for all kinds of things.
I
I
see.
think it's like a storm Matt just went through, where we couldn't get on the call for a while, but it ain't gonna be fun. So I really think it comes down to, okay, so now you talked about metadata, like what's the value add to it?
Right.
So
Yeah, in fact, that's interesting. I never heard of metadata window. So that's very interesting. I think a lot of people call it data governance, data enablement, data
sure.
intelligence. Yeah, Matt, what do you think? Where is this space of data governance, metadata, all of that heading to, and where is it today?
So I actually want to address kind of the startup situation right now, because I think it's very, very relevant to metadata. There are so many different startups operating in this space of data catalogs, data lineage, data observability, orchestration. I consider those all metadata related. And the reality is, if you look at the early heavyweight internet companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, they all occupied a huge swath of technology and business, right? So Google search just grabbed a huge chunk of search and advertising. Facebook, social. Amazon, online retail and cloud. A very basic problem you have with these new companies trying to operate in the metadata space is they're trying to solve very small problems. And my worry is that the funding to solve those small problems is going to be drying up. And that's kind of going to leave us in this winter that Joe was talking about. So potentially you're going to see a lot of consolidation, and some startups in the space just shut down, which is really unfortunate. And the problem with consolidation is that it's going to kind of undermine standards, right? So if Amazon buys a player in this space, they're not going to be as motivated to interoperate with other players, which is a huge problem because the entire point of metadata is to interoperate across a lot of different systems.
Well, I think as you and I joke, Matt, I mean, one of the central laws of the universe is everything becomes informatica at some point in the data tooling space.
Yeah.
And so, meaning that everything becomes monolithic. And so it's just sort of this inevitability through consolidation and so forth. But yeah, I absolutely agree with what Matt said. So,
And Joe, we met up at the AWS reInvent conference
yeah.
a month ago, and one of the big announcements from AWS was that now they have a data catalog for business metadata. They've always had Glue, but it was only for technical metadata. Now they have Data Zone, which is for business metadata, and it just, I have to wait and see how these things will pan out. But having two catalogs just seems to me a little too much of an overhead. I'd rather see one. In fact, catalog of catalogs. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, go ahead, Joe.
Oh no, what are you gonna say, Matt?
I was going to say, so Corey Quinn wrote an article about the fragmentation problem at AWS actually a couple of weeks ago, and it was called "The Feudal Lords of AWS," and he was talking about how at AWS, there's this huge motivation to launch new services. And so you get into this situation where instead of expanding an existing catalog, someone goes off and launches a new catalog, which probably doesn't interoperate with the old one, which again, now you have this problem within one company instead of across the entire internet. So it seems like this is a bigger question that Amazon needs to address. Like, how do they reconcile all these different services and make them interoperate better?
Yeah. Joe, you had some thoughts?
I mean, it kind of my first impression is I thought it was Amazon's early take at building a data mesh product.
Right.
So so that was my first impression of it. Whether or not it actually accomplishes that, it remains to be seen. I need to actually go check it out and play around with it to get more familiar with it. But I do agree. Two catalogs, is that better than one? I mean, Glue Data Catalog, I felt like that was the term data catalog. Maybe wasn't the best way to describe what Glue did, because it was just I have Metastore and just build a schema on top of that. So it was like a schema, um, with crawlers and whatnot, which I mean, I think is great. You definitely need that, especially for all your data in S3. But calling it a catalog, I would say it sort of jarred my opinion of that, because I always thought like a data catalog had definitions, a central place to search my data in order to get fidelity on the data that I have and where it is. But
You know what I find? Yeah, go ahead.
Glue is one of these products that I feel is just it's to Matt's point, it feels like it's sort of the schizophrenic product in a sense, where it's on one hand an ETL engine, on the other hand it's a catalog, and it's like I'm not. And the problem is when it becomes like that, the issue for the user is you get priced in many different ways, right? You get charged in many different ways, and that makes it a bit more difficult too. So
yeah.
But
So Joe, you're on a roll today. We've talked about Monty Python Life of Brian. We've talked about Glue being schizophrenic. And then there was another interesting thing that you mentioned.
the metadata winter or something.
Yes,
I don't know.
metadata winter. So wow. So
Still waking up here. So
yes, yeah, but this is amazing. In fact, another new catalog that launched in 2022 is Unity catalog from Databricks, which is very interesting, because the next topic we want to talk about is what's going on in the world of data lakehouses versus cloud data warehouse. And so Matt, let's start with you this time. What do you think how is this space panning out?
So one of the things we talked about in our kind of pre-meeting, Sanjeev, was the difference on scale. And to be honest, I don't necessarily see a big difference in terms of scalability. I think both of these options, the option you choose really depends on your use case. And so if you want simplicity, then you're probably going to go with the cloud data platform or data warehouse. I know Snowflake doesn't like the term data warehouse anymore. And if you want more programmability, yeah, if you want more programmability, then you're probably going to go to the Lakehouse. The problem we found with Lakehouses in general is that they're very promising. They have a long way to go in terms of ease of use. The whole point of the modern Lakehouse is that it's supposed to be as simple to use as a data warehouse, right? Like you're supposed to have all these management tools that manage schemas automatically using SQL or very simply. And that just isn't quite the case yet in my experience. It is getting better, but it's going to take some time to get there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. In fact, it's funny. When I was at Bill Inman's house a couple of weeks ago, he gave me his new Data Lakehouse book, which I need to read. But why that's important is he's a guy who also came up with the data warehouse, and so, but he's bullish on the Lakehouse concept. So read into that what you wish. I feel like if we're going to attach products, or vendors to these two paradigms, Lakehouse or kind of cloud data platforms. Snowflake, I mean, it started out as a data warehouse, and that was the DNA of it. The cool thing was that it didn't need a lot of paradigm shifting for customers, right? Because it's like this is a better version of product X, Y, and Z, right? And Snowflake from early on really knew how to sell into enterprises. So I mean, I watched the growth from the beginning. I'm sure Matt did. They tried selling to his company where he was at, and I followed the progression. They just knew how to sell. I mean, bottom line is they just had the playbook to sell to enterprises. So that their success, I think, is a result of just knowing the market, knowing the customer, and just knowing how to talk to them. So that was pretty cool. And it's world class at what it does. I would say for what it's supposed to do, it's the best in the world. I'll say that right now. Databricks was a data science platform. I remember using that way back in the day too, and I'm a very early Spark user, and so it's not like I don't understand Databricks or Spark. I just feel like what's happening right now, if you kind of look at where the two companies are going, they're going to be a parity. I'm suspecting in about a year and a half. And for full disclosure, Matt and I are partners with AWS, Snowflake, and Databricks, so we really don't have a dog in the fight in any of these discussions. It's just, what's the best product for your use case, I think. And so
we're hedging our bets basically.
So it's
we love
not
everybody.
about the functionality. It's not about the functionality. It's where they're coming from and where the strengths are. In fact, after I went to both Snowflake Summit and then the Databricks event this year, I realized that each has their own strengths, but the entire conferences were focused on their weaknesses.
It's funny. It's like going to like a CrossFit competition or something. Where just like everybody's trying to get good at everything. And so it's just the DNA of the companies is different though at the end of the day, right? It's just, and I think the world perspectives are different, even though both these companies have every incentive just to beat the crap out of each other at this point. So, I'm very curious to see what 2023 brings. I know that Databricks is supposed to have their IPO, for a while now, actually, and that didn't materialize. So I'm very curious to see, how this plays out in the markets. So
I had expected Databricks, Calibra, and maybe Alation to go IPO, but I think all those plans were thrown out the window. One of the VCs I was talking to was telling me they used to do 1 to 2 investment a month, and they had not done a single one in 7 months. And in fact, in the last month, they said FTX dropped a nuclear bomb. Now, like people are so wary, like VCs are so wary about investing, and that's why there's so much focus on companies, small like startups, to survive the breadth of 2023 till the market improves.
It's wise, yeah. I'm curious to see what happens, if the share prices of these companies dip. Any of them really, what happens? Do the big clouds come take them out or whatever? So it'd be fascinating.
A lot of these fashionable tech companies, they like to pay their most of their salary in stocks. And some stocks, I won't mention the name of the company, but it's very easy to guess, was trading at $300+ last June. And this year it's at 100 plus, so people actually have lost a lot of money. And so getting the talent based on stock prices is no longer a viable option.
Right. Yeah.
And Joe, I want to ask you one more question before Matt, I go to you and talk about some of the open source stuff that's happening. But Joe, I'm just curious. You said you're partners with AWS, Databricks, Snowflake. What do you think is going on with Redshift versus, let's say, Snowflake?
That's a good one. I without getting into too many details, I will describe it as there's the menu that you might be shown when you go to the restaurant. There's the things you can order off menu. So I feel like Redshift is one of these things where it's AWS's product, so they need to put some energy into it, and they certainly do. The announcements that being been about Aurora's Azure ETL and so forth, I think was pretty cool to see. But that seemed like it was really an attempt to catch up with Snowflake, and so with Unistore and whatnot, right? And so, but yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one where I would say there's a reason that you might see Snowflake, 80% of Snowflake is in AWS, for example, right? And so I've sort of joked aside to some people at AWS that maybe Redshift should just be rebranded. I feel like the product is. You got to consider it's been around for 10 years now. A few weeks ago at reInvent is when they announced it, actually 10 years ago, and I consider that the beginning of the modern data stack. But I personally feel like Redshift might be due for a bit of a reboot as a product. Because they also have Athena and EMR to that sort of all these different competing products. At the end of the day, it's a bit of a confusing mix of products that they have. And so my opinion, and Glue as well. And I feel like there's a chance to maybe reboot and come up with an entirely different offering that would, truly establish AWS is like a competing data cloud platform as well. So
okay. Do you think AWS should buy Snowflake? Just throwing it out
if the
there.
price was low enough, sure, I think that would be a great way. Yeah. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I tend to agree. What my comment on Redshift would be that I kind of feel like AWS has given up on catching up with Snowflake for functionality. Mostly the feature improvements are about improving the experience for existing customers that don't want to move. That's the reality at this point. So yeah, if they want to truly compete with Snowflake, they probably just need a reboot. It's not going to happen with the existing product.
Or since you mentioned maybe just buy them. I
Maybe
would.
just
If the stock price is low enough, hell yeah. Well, same with Azure and Databricks. I mean, if I'm Azure, I would look at Databricks as being the maybe just
That
bring
was
that
the
in.
thought for many years.
Yeah.
That Microsoft will just buy Databricks, but that didn't happen, and I think it's too late now. So, but
Might be. Yeah.
It's hard to say
see.
though. I mean, there are so many. The financial environment is so unpredictable from my perspective right now for 2023, and so anything could happen. I don't know.
So Matt, moving on to open source ecosystem, what's going on in that space? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think Red Hat was kind of the flagship like open source as a product company for a long time, and from my perspective, at this point, they got purchased by IBM. They're slowly dying. Like, talking to a lot of people about Linux, I don't have statistics or anything, but you can read various trade publications. It feels like there's just this shift toward Linux as a service and not Linux as a product these days. So meaning you go to Google and you're going to get Linux as part of almost any environment you choose. You go to AWS, you get Linux just built in, some version of Linux. And I think that's the future for open source. I think basically we've been slowly for the last decade moving toward open source as a component and not open source as a product. So open source is used to back all kinds of exciting cloud services, but you don't just pay for one open source item. And that means that if I'm building a company around open source, I really need to add some special sauce to my service that differentiates it from the open source software itself. I think that's been a real struggle for a number of players in the space, but those players that can solve that problem do have a future, maybe an eventual IPO down the road. Those who can't solve that problem are probably going to get acquired or something else. So yeah.
I started the year very upbeat about one open source product in our data and analytics space, and that's Postgres. But I'm ending this year feeling even more excited about this whole trifecta of open source table formats like Apache Iceberg, Delta from Linux Foundation and Databricks, and Apache Hudi. So I think these formats actually goes back to the whole Lakehouse concept, provide me to bring any analytical engine I want. So it disaggregates as long as it supports, let's say, Iceberg. I can use Trino, I can use Spark, I can use Dask, whatever I want to do, I have that capability.
Yeah, and Databricks is a great example of this phenomenon. I mean, I would say like 5 years ago, Databricks was just a wrapper for Spark, right? It was just like a Spark-based product. And now Databricks has turned into so much more, like Unity Catalog, for example. They've had to build a lot of functionality that's not in their open source product to really differentiate themselves. And going back to the data mesh conversation, these formats like Hudi and Iceberg, maybe that will be the basis of data mesh in the future, just these interoperable like open source formats that anyone can latch on to exchange data with other platforms.
Yeah. So let's move on. But this discussion is phenomenally interesting. Joe, you touched upon Unistore from Snowflake and the zero ETL between Amazon Aurora and Amazon Redshift, this whole merging of transactional processing with analytical processing. We could spend a whole hour talking about that. But I want to shift gears and talk about it. Up until last year, we were all focused on performance and functionality. But this year, the focus seems to have shifted to cost optimization, FinOps, and all of that. So Joe, what are you seeing in the space of cost optimization?
A lot. So yeah, it's like people discovered that money matters, and that you need to control costs. I don't know. The strange thing is I don't know why this is a dawning realization to companies, but I guess when things are easygoing and money's abundant. It's easy to hide a few things, or I would say more to the point, ignore them, right? And so, but what as Charlie Munger says, like, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. So if the incentive now is to focus on reducing costs, then I guess where your attention is going to be. So, but I mean, cost optimization can mean a lot of things, though, right? There's your capital expenditures and OpEx and personnel costs you know, and so forth. So when I talk to a lot of the big vendors, of which I won't name, but I'm sure you can guess, the name of the game right now is just figuring out how you're going to have your, if I'm a salesperson for these companies, I'm going to try and figure out, okay, so how am I going to keep my customers happy? What's the balance between encouraging consumption growth while also retaining a customer? These are not the same thing. It's back in the day, it was all about how can I drive consumption upwards. Now it's just like, how can I keep my company, or how can I keep my customers, in kind of a default, survival mode while, trying to retain them. So, if you can grow consumption, terrific, but I don't think that's a discussion right now from a vendor standpoint. So what does that mean for customers? It means, yeah, I would say everything is under scrutiny at this point.
Do people know where the costs are? Like, do people have the clear understanding as to where in the pipeline the cost is very high?
It's tricky, right? I mean, if you go into your AWS console or your GCP console or whatever, I mean, it's sort of, if you know where to look, I would say it's tolerable to find these costs. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's not like they just have a dashboard that shows you automatic, like here's where you can be saving money. It's more like you got to figure that out. So yeah, I think Matt and I talked a lot about FinOps being the big driver for 2023. But FinOps has two sides to it, right? Where it's like it's cost control, but it's also figuring out how you're going to do more with less to make money. So Matt, I don't know if you want to expound on that.
Yeah, actually, I have another comment too, which is part of the problem we're seeing in cloud environments is to do with high costs, and the other part is just the financial side of companies struggling to wrap their minds around a new charging model. In some cases, it's not that the costs are so high, it's the fact that you're shifting from CapEx to OpEx. And I think CFOs are used to signing, multi-million-dollar database contracts for several years. You sign on the dotted line. This is exactly what you're going to pay. That's it. And getting charged every month or, every day, even if you look at the bill just racking up, it is a big paradigm shift. And in terms of that paradigm shift, this actually happened a long time ago in supply chain. And Joe, you can say a lot more about this, but like with the old way of doing supply chain was that you would sign for big tranches of items. I'm going to buy, 50,000 of this item. Here you go. Whereas with just in time, it's like, all right, you're basically ordering every day to fulfill your demand. And then those bills just come as you're taking orders. And so I think we need to see the same paradigm shift in IT acquisitions. That doesn't mean that we don't need FinOps. We definitely need to rethink that too, because the situation right now is basically like the CFOs are having to hand their credit cards to these like analytics teams and things. CFOs don't like giving their credit cards to individual teams to spend a lot of money. They definitely want to have a pulse on what's going on. But yeah, I think part of it is FinOps practices, and part of it is just kind of retraining the financial side of the company to understand this new charging model that really is more like just in time.
Well, I think there's a couple threads to this. Like we had one, it depends also on what the value to the shareholder is at the end of the day, right? So we had one client where their true north for some reason was EBITDA, right? So if people are familiar with that, and so this actually forced them to avoid the cloud for a long time because the OpEx wouldn't appear as an ongoing expense, right? They don't want to take a hit in expenses too quickly. They want to drag it out and make that curve look smoother. So I thought that was a very interesting trick, even though the CEO, did acknowledge that the lack of flexibility due to their on-prem and CapEx expenditures were causing just a giant lack of flexibility and innovation in the company. But because the company was incentivized to focus only on EBITDA, then CFO is going to do what they do. Again, incentives and outcomes, right? And so I also feel like to Matt's comment on education, I'll take this a step further and say that it's certainly an education for the financial people. There's also the education for just knowing how the cloud works and how to operate in the cloud in a cost performant model. This is surprisingly not something where Matt and I have seen a lot of teams be as effective as they could, which is shocking. You would think that in this day and age, teams would be very familiar with how to operate in the cloud. Come to find out, I mean, I hate to say it, but companies like ours exist precisely because people just don't take the time to understand the way you should be doing things. And so,
and Corey Quinn's Doug Bell Group and so many others.
bingo.
Cloud economists. Yeah, I think it's very interesting, this whole paradigm shift. How I remember when Teradata first came out, Teradata was built in the era of scarcity. Everything was super expensive, except maybe labor. Storage was extremely expensive, CPU was expensive. So they built this architecture in a very parsimonious way. But then the modern cloud came up and then resources were cheap. So it was like, okay, no problem. You want to do 10 table join, we'll just use up all these resources. And I think that has come back to bite us.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk about more of this about this in a bit. I think that there's some root causes to a lot of this stuff too, but it definitely feels like, Matt, when we talk to people on data teams, Matt, it's weird. Matt and I talk about this stuff all the time. So it's to us, it's this kind of old hat, right? But then we talk to people whose jobs it is just to, data engineers and data scientists, and we're just like even basic budget monitoring and, thresholds and tagging resources and just practices like that would probably yield quite a bit of leverage in terms of cost control. Like these aren't being done, which has been a bit surprising, but it is what it is.
Yeah. So is DataOps one way for us to get better understanding about what's going on in our system, introduce orchestration, automation, testing? I even put data observability under the big umbrella of DataOps. So Matt, what do you think about DataOps as a category?
So I think there are a couple of different threads here. There's the practice of data ops, and then there's all the tools that go into running data ops. And we sometimes confuse the two, right? And I understand where vendors are coming from. They want to sell their product as the unique and only data ops solution to solve all your problems. The reality is the products are important, but you really need a team that can define a data ops practice and how you're going to operationalize all these data practices. Let's see, if in terms of the maturity of data ops products, let's talk about that side. And then Joe, maybe you can talk about the practices side after that. The orchestration part is the most mature space. At the same time, there's like this huge pitched battle going on. You have the established player, Airflow, and then you have all these upstart players that are doing really cool things like Prefect and Dagster and even more. In terms of other parts of the other slices of the data ops world, FinOps is extremely immature. I suspect someone is going to launch a data FinOps product like 2023, or maybe they already have and I'm just not aware of it. Observability is extremely crowded, as we all know. Like there are just so many companies operating in this space. Testing is still a big opportunity. There are a couple of companies operating there, but it's still immature. Cataloging, lineage, I think, are growing up somewhat. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this, Joe?
Yeah, and I've been thinking a bit about this question, and I feel like there's a few threads. It really does come back to the old trite people, process, and technology at the end of the day. And I feel like there's a lot of tooling around data ops and data observability and so forth. But unless you have the knowledge and the practices on the people part, it's kind of like a lot of this is, I would say, just a mere formality. Putting in alerting is not the same thing as understanding the root cause of why you got alerts. So that to me is sort of the dichotomy. And you see this in software, right? Where people sort of Prometheus and Grafana, and have the big screen and whatnot, and and get Slack alerts and stuff. But that, and I think it forces some behavior on teams, and hopefully in a good way. But I see software teams still having trouble with a lot of even DevOps, and so if you kind of look at the natural continuum between like data and dev, right? Data, in my opinion, is at least 5 to 10 years behind software in terms of general practices, if not more. And so it just means that data ops is still extremely immature. And I think most of that does come back to the cultural and organizational aspects of data itself. And so
yeah. I recently ran data observability was a topic, and I got a lot of pushback from people saying, is this a hype? And why do I need data observability? So I see why there's so many companies in this space, because in my opinion, it's a problem of our own making, the data quality being such a wild card. Most businesses openly say, we don't trust our data. We don't even know where it's coming from. There's no transparency. So I feel that data ops helps bring that transparency. And the thing is that if we don't do data observability, then what do we have? We are blindsided. We don't know what's going on in our data. So Joe, to your point, software has had observability for a long time. And through the agile practices and the APMs, and they achieved that transparency, and I think it's for data to get there.
Well, for sure. And you manage what you can measure, right? So if you can't, like you said, Sanjeev, I mean, in so many words, you can't hit what you can't see. And I wear an Apple Watch, and I'm sure other people do too, for tracking all kinds of fun stuff, right? And I think what it's done is it's shown a mirror onto different aspects of how you live, and what you choose to do with that after the fact is your own call. But at least you're aware of certain metrics. And
that's great.
So, Matt, you're going to say something?
Oh, yeah. What I was going to add here, I think it goes back to your point earlier, Sanjeev, about back, 20 years ago, labor was the cheap part, and the storage and the systems and the licenses were expensive. And now labor has gotten very expensive, and the tools are supposed to be the cheap part, right? And what that's led to is what I'll call an over-democratization. In other words, you have like analysts with no extra training basically trying to do the job of data engineers who really understand nothing about quality. It's not to say these analysts couldn't become great data engineers, but if they don't have training and support, that's not going to happen. And I guess the point is that you can't just throw tools at that problem. You need people who actually have experience and training and can develop a proper practice around the tools.
Very nice. So moving on. So the next topic, and this one is very different from what we've been talking about. This one has to do with edge computing, where we see on-prem, hybrid, public, private cloud. So Joe, what are your thoughts on edge computing, let's say?
I think there's some cool things. Hopefully this continues during the downturn. I'm very bullish on edge. The thing I'm super stoked about is technologies like MotherDuck, for example. DuckDB running in the browser. I think it has the potential of well, there's a couple threads to this. In my mind, if it's executed correctly, it has the potential to usher in a whole new wave of data tooling and interactive applications, especially customer-facing interactive applications, where you don't have to, go back and forth to your traditional cloud data platform, and they just weren't built for that, right? I think something like MotherDuck really does enable that. So for me, the question is something like MotherDuck basically does it usher in a new wave of applications, or is it just basically Microsoft Access 2.0? I don't know yet. I say this half jokingly because I'm friends with the MotherDuck crew.
I told Jordan it's.
I'll see. Well, I mean, I'm not afraid to say it. I mean, I think it's more of a tongue-in-cheek example. I would say, I like if it, but there's also Jordan's really smart, right? I mean, he if I were to take a bet on somebody in this industry, it's him and his team that he's built. It's kind of sort of like the Avengers, and so anything these people do, I would expect that it's going to be great. I mean, you got to remember this is among the team that created a lot of great stuff at Google, right? It's not like these guys don't understand data.
BigQuery.
So exactly. So now it's back to like mini query or whatever it is. But
easy query, I think he called it.
Easy query. Yeah, that's what he called it.
At one point,
query.
yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, because the notion was, because what he noticed was a lot of companies were BigQuery was pitched as a big data product. And the whole notion was you could query kilobytes or petabytes of data, and it's the same thing. But what he noticed was most companies were using it for small amounts of data, and the whole notion really was, well, I can query this really easily. I just give it data and go, and that's it. Right. So.
And Matt, what are your thoughts on edge?
So I think in the history of computing, we've seen a lot of pendulum swings from centralized computing to decentralized computing. So way back in the day, right, before PCs showed up, you had timeshare machines. You had these big mainframes. You'd like sign on, you'd pay per hour to have access to a slice of machine. And then eventually we had PCs and Macs, and everyone could get their own box and do their own computing. And then the internet came along. And so we moved back to a centralized server model. And then eventually where we landed was a hybrid where your phone or your laptop has a super powerful CPU, does a lot of local computing, but it's backed, web apps are backed by this remote, like heavy duty stack. And so the two collaborate to get things done. And I think the future of data is that a lot of computation will happen on your local machine for small queries, and you'll cache data so you don't have to go to the cloud to grab stuff that you're already querying. But when you have to do a heavy duty query or you need to pull fresh data, you go out to the cloud to get it. So eventually I think we're going to land there. And I think MotherDuck may be part of that. Maybe there are going to be other players in the space. I mean, we're not going to get there in 2023, but by the maybe next 5 years, the next decade, I think we'll land on a model that looks like that. And that's
well,
exciting.
there's also the discussion of on-prem versus cloud, right? I think that's another thing that he has. So I think that the cloud or the cost discussion is going to come back into vogue. I feel like again in pendulums we swung all the way to the cloud, and that's great for quite a few use cases, especially when you want flexibility of workloads. I mean, if you have more predictable workloads, where it's just more mature, it might make more sense to go on-prem. I think, David Hennemeyer Hansen's article. Yeah, repatriation, exactly. DHH had an article, how, Basecamp and Hay had moved back to on-prem, and that saved them a bunch of money. And that tells me a couple of things. One, for their use case, that made a lot of sense. And two, that indicates that they have a very mature product that's not seeing a lot of growth. Or if it is, it's very predictable growth. And so if you don't have the spikes where you need to have the load balancing and whatnot, then it might make sense to do that.
Another exciting development is WASM, or WebAssembly.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I think that could be one of those killer silent technologies that take over, where you can run your entire database in the browser. Because browser, Matt, to your point, is a standard, would you say?
I think so. I mean, it's not always an ideal standard. There's a lot of jostling and elbowing that happens, right? Like standards don't always end up.
Matt.
He was so emphatic. He just wants to keep that pose.
Product, turn it into a standard. We know how this works.
Hey, right? Matt, can you go back about 30 seconds? Okay, cool. But I also feel like the WASM thing could end up being. So I remember the days of Napster. Back in the day, it's something I was thinking about for the last couple of days too. And I feel like if you really want a data mesh to work, I actually think we're thinking about it the wrong way. I actually think we're, instead of relying on these big technologies, in the big clouds, which inherently, you have centralization without calling it centralization. Something like WASM, for example, might enable something like data mesh, where now it's. Well, yeah, I mean, because I can have a data mesh on my phone, I can have a data mesh on my computer. It becomes a true peer-to-peer protocol, right? In the sense, and so one of the things when I start thinking about MotherDuck, I don't know, I think I told Shamak this, but I was like, oh, well, something like basically running WASM in your browser would mean that you bypass all the gatekeepers inherently, right? Now you just need to figure out all the interop protocols for that, but that could be a suggestion too.
Yeah. So Joe, this is again another topic that we could talk about. I think this is super exciting, and what you just opened up new thought process of WASM as the enabler for data mesh. But let's park that thought. The rumor on the street, Joe, is that you have discovered your love for writing, and you're now writing your second book on data modeling. What's up with data modeling?
Lots up with it, I feel like. Let's rewind. I mean, data modeling, I think, goes through a pendulum itself, right? Where what tends to happen, I've noticed in history, and I've been going back reading the whole history of database data modeling, and it seems like every new basically database paradigm, new way of collecting and storing information brings about a new way of modeling it, right? So relational databases, you had COD, that was what ended up becoming the popular paradigm for relational databases. Relational databases, also, that whole history is very interesting, where there was a point where it actually might not have happened. But that's a different subject. data warehouses, right? That ushered in a new way of modeling data for dimensional modeling and, and so forth. And now I feel like, with the modern data stack and quote analytics engineering and NoSQL and big data, what I've noticed is it's almost the pendulum swung the other way between what I call fast and formal practices. Formal means you're spending a lot of time modeling your data, relating business concepts to, and whatnot to basically the data that you're going to use for whatever you're going to use it for. But a lot of those practices were sort of thrown to the wayside, I would say, during the last 10 years, because things moved to the fast end of the pendulum, right? If I can do things quickly, well, who gives a crap about formalities? I just want to, move fast. And so that was sort of the mantra. And now I think we're dealing with a lot of the consequences of lack of rigorous data modeling or formal data modeling, or even just data modeling in general. A lot of people don't know these techniques, whether you're software engineers or they work with data and machine learning. And this has consequences. I can make a very strong argument that the reason you have a lot of these observability tools and data quality tools is because you didn't put the upfront work into modeling. And so the goal of the book is really to, I think, take a very unopinionated view of the world and say between the pendulum of fast and formal, here are the techniques that you can use if you want to go fast. There's probably a lack of discipline, but or rightfully so in some cases, but at least be aware these are the trade-offs if you decide to take this route, and as well as the formal route. If you decide to go formal, you're going to miss out on speed and so forth. So it'll also cover new areas I would say that aren't touched upon, like streaming data modeling and at least basics for modeling data for machine learning and so forth. So it really fills in the gaps of the last 20 years where I would say there's been an absence of new thinking around data modeling. So it's a very ambitious book. I expect to take a lot of arrows for this one, but
so you're writing
whatever.
about modeling for machine learning, modeling for streaming data, for structured and semi-structured, I'm assuming. So quite a breadth.
Yep.
So we want to talk about streaming next, but I want to pick Matt's brain and see what do you think is happening with data modeling that you see?
Well, so I think the big problem is that, to Joe's point, there have been these pendulum swings, and in the era of tech companies, internet tech companies, there was kind of a widespread rejection of data modeling, and so the world split into two camps. You had your hardcore data modelers. This is exactly how we model data, tending to rely on somewhat older paradigms, and then you had people in the data lake camp who are like, no, don't think about data modeling, just schema on read, whatever. And I think that's why there's a need for some fresh thinking. The old paradigms were designed for different systems than we have now. We need to update those paradigms and come up with some new ideas. We need to get past this idea that you can simply reject data modeling and get good results. So yeah, I'm excited.
But we also need to reject the idea that I think that it's a one size fits all with certain techniques.
Agree.
The hardcore relational camp. I mean, dear Lord, I've been reading lots of books from these people. And I think they have a good point where it's mathematically sound and it's, first order predicate logic and so forth. On the other hand, what I found very fascinating in my research so far is just the amount of religion that occurs in data modeling. It's I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this in the data world.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I'll tell you, as a pure mathematician, that's my background. Pure mathematicians have a really hard time sometimes dealing with the real world because the real world doesn't correspond to our very precise mathematical models and axioms. And so you need some more flexible thinking. Go ahead, Sanjeev. Sorry.
I was just saying, when I started my career, I did ERD diagrams every day, and then the NoSQL movement happened, and I literally had a heart attack when people told me everything that you know is wrong. You've been doing it wrong. Unlearn and get on to this new wonderful world of NoSQL schema on read. And I was like, wait, but this is like kicking the can down the road because somebody has to model it. And, so I'm really happy to see that we are once again focused on best practices and, the focus on data modeling is back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, it's not like you have to do one or the other, but I'm just saying, at least be aware that these exist, right? It's like being aware that traffic laws exist. You can choose to obey them or not. I don't really care.
And one of the interesting things that you touched upon also is streaming. Do you see streaming taking over from batch? What's going on in the world of streaming?
I'm hopeful. I feel like I think the big macro trend that we'll be seeing is
Mhm.
very similar to the modern data stack, where the modern data stack, I think, to me, what the big thing with the modern data stack is it ushered in the democratization of what were once very expensive data warehouse and ETL tools and practices, right? And brought that to the masses. 10 years ago, 10 years and a month ago, basically, when Redshift was announced, you could get a cloud data warehouse for 25 cents an hour, right? I don't think it's hard to express like how game changing that was.
Yeah.
We were talking about other incumbents and the costly contracts you would have to sign to get these data warehouses. Now I can get a full OLAP capable data warehouse in the cloud for how much? 25 cents an hour. That's bananas. Starting at that, that's crazy. So I mean that was really cool. But what I feel is happening now with streaming is hopefully the same thing where thankfully we're approaching it from a different angle where a lot of the open source products, namely Kafka and to a lesser extent Pulsar and others were great products, and there's been companies that have formed around them. I feel like that was maybe what we call as modern streaming 1.0, the modern streaming stack of 2.0. Matt and I call it the live data stack in our book, but this is basically the democratization, the simplicity of cloud-based streaming tools for the masses. And what this will do is it will usher in streaming as a rule, not the exception. So, yeah. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, and I what I would say is the democratization of the event streaming platforms themselves, so tools like Kafka, that's already happened. You already can go into AWS and just turn on Kinesis, or go into Google and turn on Google Cloud pops up. I think the next step is the democratization of the processing layer that can actually make sense of those events in real time. One of your comments, Joe, was that like CDC, technically it relies on streaming, but it's not really, it doesn't do anything interesting with it, right? It's just, it's nice. It synchronizes two databases, but you're not doing any interesting real-time processing of the data. And so the next step is wider spread use of real-time analytics processing of data. And we'll see
like
more
events, like event processing and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, like what the peeps at Upsolver are doing, and I think Flink's seeing a resurgence right now, and I think those are stream transformations, I think, is the next big one, and that's it'll be interesting to see how that impacts sort of the modern data stack incumbents like dbt, and others. So it's just, but this is how it always goes, right?
Yeah.
So,
so let's move on to the next question, because we've come up top of the hour. So I want to ask you about self-service. What is happening in our zeal to provide business all the tools and whatever it takes to make them capable of doing analytics? I'm just wondering, is self-service the new shadow IT? Any thoughts?
I think it kind of was, right? So the version of shadow IT that we saw in this era was, again, analysts kind of doing things on their own, because suddenly you handed them all these tools. Like, here, just take Snowflake, go take Fivetran, go take dbt and build your own stack. The problem, again, is that if you don't have the training to build out a data platform using those tools, then you're going to end up with a mess. You're going to end up with like lots of repeated tables. There's this notion of JBots, just a bunch of tables. Like, you just get a huge tangled mess of data. And so I think the new paradigm of self-service is going to be a lot like the old days, where you do have a team that's backing things up. Like, yeah, you can self-service query, but we're actually here maintaining data quality, building out tables, building out schemas, modeling. Yeah. And of course, modeling is near and dear to Joe's heart, so I'll let him talk a bit about that.
Well, we'll talk about modeling in a second, but I mean, it just, it occurred to me that the real shadow self-service data system all along has been Excel. So
that's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, it has been. I mean, Matt and I call it the dark matter of the data universe. It's just like there's this stuff that you see, the data warehouses and whatnot, and then there's all this spreadsheets that everybody else uses that are not, they may or may not be attached to the data warehouse. And so I think that one aspect that I think, especially, so as with the economy downturn, what I think you're going to see is actually a resurgence of using spreadsheets. Not that they ever went away. They're the most Excel is the most widely used data platform in the world by a long shot. You got 2 billion Excel users or more actually. We'll call them spreadsheet users because there's also Google Sheets. But the whole point is, to me, when companies are forced to do more with less, they're going to go back and say, okay, so I can use the self-service data platform, or I could just use a spreadsheet. And so I think to your point, Matt, the underlying governance piece and the modeling is again going to be paramount, because the reversion against spreadsheets, the reason people hate them is because it's just a chaotic mess. What was it in HBR, an article about 10 years ago where it said like 85% of Excel sheets had errors in them. And, you know, so to me, that's another huge opportunity. So
yeah, in fact, talking about Microsoft Excel, I was quite interested to read last week. Delta Lake introduced their Microsoft Excel front end. So this is a great development where it's a combination of decentralized and centralized. So the centralized team is responsible for, as you said, data modeling, data quality, some of the underpinnings of data, cataloging, business glossary, making sure there's a consistency there. And then you've got the decentralized business units, lines of business. They can use the same data, but they can bring their own tools like Excel, spreadsheet. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I saw Alation and Atlan. They both introduced Excel as a way to bring out metadata, do your visualization and all of that through Excel. So that's pretty exciting news for the world of self-service.
And it's funny, Google actually did this several years ago with Google Sheets and
Google
BigQuery.
Sheets.
But of course, the user base for Google Sheets, I suspect, the more serious user base for Google Sheets is probably a lot smaller than like the serious business user base for Excel. And so I think the impact of that was a lot lower than this announcement. It just underscores Joe's point that like Excel is just everywhere, whether we want it to be or not. Correct. And that's why companies build these features into their heavy duty data platforms, right? Like the scale you're talking about is completely different, and yet you still want to connect these two sides together, the big data side and the kind of desktop data side.
Well, guess what's going to play a role in that too? Data modeling. So
yeah, data modeling, data standards. Yeah.
Bingo. Yeah, has to happen. So yeah,
that is great. So we brought it all together. I know we can go on for a long time, but I also want to be respectful for viewers who are listening. Any last words before we end our recording for today?
I mean, I wrote an article about this over last week about just sort of how the era of cheap money, I think, brought on some very interesting behaviors with data teams. And I'm actually excited to see what happens next. I feel like a whole era of data teams were brought up in an era of abundance and free of constraints of time, money, and patience. And I really feel, as much as downturns suck, it's a chance to get back to basics.
Yeah.
And it's a reality check. And I think the industry has been in sore need of a reality check for a while. So, I mean, that to me is what I'm quite excited about, just to see what happens when you really do have to focus on things that are going to move the needle. So,
and Matt, what's your message for next year?
So more broadly, I would say that the era of tech company magical thinking is kind of over, right? Like look at Twitter and Facebook and all these companies where the assumption was they're going to grow forever. They're just on this, they're rocket ships that are never going to come back down to earth. That thinking is over. And like Joe said, it is kind of back to best practices. And so I think it's a great opportunity for thought leadership and to define new team practices to really do more with less instead of just massive profligate spending of resources and money.
Yeah, very well said. I want to end here by just telling the viewers 2023 may have a rocky start. We don't know, but buckle up. We're doing the right things. We're getting, like both of you said, back to the basics and making sure our fundamentals are strong. So stay put, and this will be an exciting year ahead. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Joe. I know this is holiday season. You guys have been amazing. And thank you for sharing your thoughts with the community.
Of course. Thank you, Sanjeev. Pleasure to be with you as always.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
You're very welcome.